My name is Sophia Garrett, and I am 41 years old. And I need you to understand something. Before I tell you a single word of what happened to me, I need you to understand that the person who hurt me most in this world was not a stranger, was not an enemy, was not someone I had ever wronged or crossed or given any reason to come after me. The person who looked me in the eye for 30 years and called me his sister, and then took everything I had built with my own hands and signed his name to it, and walked away like it was nothing. That person shared my blood and my childhood bedroom wall, and my mother's cooking and my father's funeral. And every Christmas morning I can remember, from the time I was old enough to remember Christmas things. And I want you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. I want you to really sit with it, because the particular pain of being betrayed by a sibling is unlike any other pain I know. It is not the clean, sharp pain of a stranger's cruelty. It is something that goes all the way down, something that rewrites your entire history, because suddenly every memory you thought was safe is suspect. Every moment of closeness is re-examined. Every time he was kind, you find yourself wondering if that kindness was already calculating something. And I spent a long time in that re-examination, a long time in that particular grief. And then I stopped grieving and I started documenting, and the documentation became the most important thing I ever did in my life, more important than the business itself, more important than the recovery, more important than anything except maybe the moment when a federal judge in a courtroom in Nashville, Tennessee, picked up a stack of papers that I had compiled over 7 years and began reading them out loud in a room where my brother sat 12 feet away from me with nowhere to go, and no version of events that could survive contact with what was written on those pages. And I am going to tell you everything, every single piece of it, from the very beginning, because you deserve the full story, and because the full story is the only version that makes the ending make sense. So let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to a house in a suburb of Nashville called Brentwood. A house that was comfortable and warm and full of the particular organized chaos of a family that had enough, but not too much. My father was a man named Robert Garrett. He was an engineer at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, and he was steady and deliberate and honest in the way that people are honest, when honesty is simply the only option they have ever considered. My father was not a complicated man, and I mean that as a compliment. He knew what he believed, and he lived by it, and he treated the people around him with a consistency and a fairness that I have spent my entire adult life trying to emulate. My mother was Eleanor Garrett. She was a teacher for 26 years, middle school science, and she had the particular combination of patience and sharpness that good teachers develop. She could read a room, and she could read a person. And she was warm in a way that made everyone who came into our house feel immediately at ease. And then there were the two of us, my brother Nathan and me. Nathan was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was small enough to look up at him, he was my hero in the uncomplicated way that younger siblings sometimes make heroes of their older siblings before the world have had a chance to complicate the picture. Nathan was charming. Nathan was always charming. He had a smile that made people want to give him things, and a laugh that made rooms feel warmer, and a way of making everyone around him feel like they were the most interesting person he had ever met. And these qualities served him extremely well socially, and somewhat less well, in terms of actual sustained effort and follow-through. Because the thing about charm is that it can substitute for substance for a very long time before the substitution becomes apparent. And Nathan had been substituting charm for substance since approximately the 5th grade, and nobody in our family had ever quite called him on it, because his charm worked as well on our parents as it worked on everyone else. My father thought Nathan was magnetic. My mother thought Nathan was sensitive. I thought Nathan was wonderful. We were all, in our various ways, wrong about him. Or rather, we were right about the surface and completely unprepared for what was underneath. And I want to tell you about myself during these years, because my own story is as important as Nathan's story. And the two stories are inseparable from each other, in ways that only became fully clear to me much later. I was a serious child, not unhappy but serious. I was the kind of child who asked questions and then listened carefully to the answers, and then asked follow-up questions. I was the kind of child who read the instruction manual before assembling the toy, and who kept her school binders organized by color, and who lay awake at night thinking about how things worked and why. I was interested in everything, but most deeply interested in business, in the mechanics of how things were made and sold and valued. I read my father's business magazines when I was 12 and understood them well enough to have opinions about them. And my father took those opinions seriously, which was one of the great gifts of my childhood. He never talked down to me about money or business or the way the world worked. He talked to me like someone who was genuinely curious and genuinely capable. And that treatment shaped me in ways I am still discovering. And in school, I was good, not flashy good, but solid good. The kind of student who got excellent grades because she did the work and understood the material and showed up prepared every single day. And Nathan was the kind of student who got inconsistent grades because he was brilliant in bursts and absent in between, and who charmed his way through the gaps, and who graduated high school with a transcript that looked like a mountain range, all peaks and valleys, while mine looked like a steady upward slope, and we both went to college. I went to Vanderbilt on a partial academic scholarship and worked part-time to cover the rest and studied business with the focused intensity of someone who has known since she was 12 what she wants to do with her life. And Nathan went to a smaller school in Tennessee on my parents' money and changed his major 3 times and graduated a year late with a degree in communications that he described as versatile, and that my father privately told me he wasn't sure what to do with. And after college, I went to work. I took a job at a consulting firm in Nashville, a good firm with a rigorous culture and demanding clients. And I worked hard and learned fast and was promoted twice in 3 years. And all the while I was developing an idea that had been forming since my college years. And that was becoming more specific and more real with every month I spent in the working world. The idea was a business, a specific kind of business, a marketing and brand consulting firm focused exclusively on small and medium-sized businesses in the food and beverage industry. I had identified a gap: food and beverage businesses, restaurants, and specialty food producers and craft beverage companies were chronically underserved by traditional marketing consultants who either didn't understand the industry or charged fees that only large corporations could afford. And I understood the industry because my mother's side of the family had been in food service for generations. I had grown up in restaurant kitchens and food production environments, and I understood the specific challenges and the specific culture and the specific way that food and beverage entrepreneurs thought about their brands. And I knew I could build something that served them in a way that nothing else in the market was serving them. And I spent 2 years after college planning and saving and researching and testing the idea in small ways before I did anything formal. And during those 2 years, Nathan floated. He went from job to job in the unfocused way of someone who is waiting for something to arrive rather than going to find it. He worked at a radio station for 8 months and then a PR agency for 6, and then did some freelance writing that produced inconsistent income and required consistent financial support from my parents, who gave it to him without complaint. Because this was Nathan, and Nathan was always just about to find his thing, and I watched all of this with a mixture of concern and the specific frustration of someone who has been doing the work while someone else waits for the work to do itself. And I said nothing. I want to be clear about that. I said nothing critical to Nathan about his choices during this period, because I genuinely believed that Nathan was going to find his way, and I genuinely didn't want to be the sister who lectured. I just kept doing my own thing and building my own plan, and putting distance between myself and the starting line every single day, while Nathan stood at the starting line looking for a more comfortable pair of shoes. And then my father died. He died when I was 27, and Nathan was 30. A heart attack that came without warning on a Thursday afternoon in March, while he was at his desk at the manufacturing firm, and losing my father was the single worst thing that had ever happened to me up to that point. And for a long time afterward, my father was the person I had built my sense of the world on, and without him, the world felt unsteady in a way that nothing else could fix, and my mother was devastated in the quiet way she did everything. She held herself together with the same discipline she had applied to everything else in her life. But I could see underneath the holding together, and what I saw was loss in its most complete form. And Nathan was there in the aftermath. Nathan was genuinely present in the weeks after my father's death, in a way that reminded me of the brother I had loved before the adult complications had set in. He sat with my mother, and he handled the practical arrangements with a competence that surprised me. And he was tender in a way that made me think perhaps I had been too quick to feel the frustration. Perhaps Nathan was growing into something. Perhaps the loss had clarified something for him the way loss sometimes does. And I held on to that hope the way you hold on to hope about someone you love, more tightly than the evidence strictly warrants. And my father left us what he had, the house and some savings and a life insurance policy that was modest but meaningful. And my mother was taken care of, not extravagantly but securely. And Nathan and I each received a small inheritance that my father had set aside separately. Mine was $22,000, and Nathan's was the same amount. And my father had written us each a letter to go with it. His letters were handwritten and specific, and mine said, "Sophia, you have always known what you were building. Use this toward it." And I read that letter 6 times the night after the will was read, and I held the $22,000 and my father's words like two parts of the same thing, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with both of them. And so I started the business. I left the consulting firm, and I incorporated Garrett Brand Consulting in Nashville, Tennessee. When I was 28 years old, I rented a small office space and bought the necessary equipment and hired one part-time contractor and launched a website and started reaching out to every food and beverage contact I had built over the previous years. And the beginning was exactly as hard as I had expected, and I had expected it to be very hard. The first 6 months were months of relentless outreach and modest results and careful financial management, and the particular loneliness of building something from scratch that has no audience yet. But I had planned for the hard beginning, and I had the savings to weather it, and I had my father's $22,000. And I had his letter, and I had the absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing in the right market at the right time. And by month 8, I had 5 paying clients, and by month 14, I had 12. And the revenue was real, and the reputation was beginning to build in the Nashville food and beverage community, which is a genuine community, tight-knit and word-of-mouth driven, and a good reputation in that community spreads faster and matters more than any advertising I could have bought, and I was good at what I did. I want to say that clearly and without false modesty. I was genuinely excellent at brand consulting for food and beverage businesses. I understood my clients' products and their markets and their stories, and I could translate all of that into brand identities and marketing strategies that actually worked, that moved product and built loyalty, and created the kind of emotional connection between a food brand and its customers that drives long-term business success. And my clients knew it, and they told other people, and those other people became clients, and Garrett Brand Consulting grew. And during this period, Nathan came back into my life in a specific way. He had been living in Memphis for a year and a half doing something, an event promotion that had not gone as planned. And he came back to Nashville, and he came to see me at my office, and he sat across from me, and he looked at what I had built, and I could see something happen in his face. I could see him assessing it the way he assessed things, with the quick, charm-adjacent intelligence that was Nathan's particular brand of smart. And he said, "Sophia, this is really impressive." And I said, "Thank you, Nathan." And he said, "I mean it. You built something real here." And I said, "I worked hard at it." And he said, "I know you did. I know." And then he said, I've been thinking about what I'm good at and what I want. And I think the thing I'm best at is relationships. I'm good with people. You know that." And I said, "Yes, Nathan, I know that." And he said, "And this kind of business, brand consulting, it's really a relationship business, isn't it? It's about connecting with clients and understanding them and building trust." And I said, "It's also about understanding brand strategy and marketing fundamentals and creative execution." And he said, "Of course, yes, but the foundation is relationships." And I said, "Yes, the foundation is relationships." And he said, "So I could contribute to that. I could be the person who goes out and builds the client relationships while you do the strategic work." And I looked at my brother across my desk, and I thought about my father's letter, and I thought about the weeks after the funeral when Nathan had been present and tender. And I thought about the hope I had been holding. And I said, "Nathan, if you want to be part of this, I need you to be serious. I need you to commit for real and show up every day and do the work even when it's not exciting." And he said, "Sophia, I'm ready. I'm finally ready. I've been drifting, and I know it, and I'm ready to stop drifting and build something. And I want it to be this. I want to build this with you." And I believed him. I want you to understand that I genuinely believed him. Because I wanted to believe him, And because he was convincing, and because he was my brother, and because hope is a powerful distortion of judgment when it is aimed at someone you love. And so I brought Nathan into Garrett Brand Consulting. I made him a partner, not an equal partner. I had built the company, and I retained 60% ownership, and Nathan received 40% in exchange for a commitment to business development and client relationship management. And we had a partnership agreement drafted by an attorney. I insist on that detail because it matters to what comes later. We had a proper legal partnership agreement, and both of us signed it. And it specified our ownership percentages and our roles and our responsibilities, and the conditions under which either partner could exit the arrangement. And that document went into a filing cabinet in my office and into a scanned copy on my computer and into a backup drive. And a copy with my attorney because I was meticulous about documentation. I had been meticulous about documentation. From the first day I started the business, every contract and every invoice and every bank statement and every email of any business significance went into a system that I maintained with the same disciplined precision I brought to everything else. And this documentation habit, this almost compulsive record keeping, that some of my early employees found slightly excessive. This was going to become the most important thing I ever did, though I did not know yet how important it was going to be, or for what reason it was going to matter. I just knew that clean records were the foundation of a clean business, and a clean business was what I had promised my father I would build. And Nathan joined, and for a while, for a genuinely good while, it worked. Nathan was brilliant at the relationship piece. He was everything he had said. He was in terms of connecting with people and making clients feel understood and valued. He would take a prospective client to lunch and come back with a signed letter of intent and a relationship that felt like it had been built over years rather than hours. He had a gift for it that was real and that I respected, and the business grew faster with Nathan in it because his relationship skills opened doors that my more reserved approach would have taken longer to open, and we were good together in those early months, complementary in the way that I had hoped we would be. And I want to be honest and say that there was a period of maybe 18 months where I thought I had been right to believe in him, where the hope had been justified and the decision had been sound. And then things began to shift. The shift was gradual. The way important shifts always are, not a single dramatic moment, but a series of small things that accumulated into a pattern that I should have named earlier, and didn't name early enough because I didn't want to see it. Nathan started coming in late, and I noticed but said nothing, because his output was still good. Nathan started taking longer lunches, and I noticed but said nothing because the client relationships were still strong. Nathan started being vague about what he was doing when he wasn't in the office, and I noticed but told myself he was working in his own way, Nathan's own way, and who was I to insist that his way look like my way? And then the expenses started. Small things at first, a client dinner that seemed expensive for the number of people involved, a travel expense that I couldn't quite reconcile with the client visit it was supposedly for, a piece of equipment charged to the company account that I never saw in the office. And I asked about these things. I asked carefully and non-confrontationally, and Nathan had an answer for every single one, smooth and immediate and completely plausible. The dinner had included some additional guests he was cultivating. The travel had been necessary because the client had changed locations at the last minute. The equipment was at his home office because he worked better there. And I accepted these explanations because they were plausible and because Nathan delivered them with the specific fluency of someone who had been practicing fluency his entire life. And the months went on, and the business continued to grow, and the expenses continued to be slightly mysterious, and I continued to ask. And Nathan continued to explain. And somewhere in the second year of our partnership, something shifted in me that I can only describe as the activation of a very old and very quiet survival instinct. The same instinct that makes you check the stove twice before leaving the house. The same instinct that makes you save a text message you weren't sure you were going to need. And I started keeping a second set of records. Not instead of the regular records, but in addition to them, a personal file that I maintained separately from the business system. A file where I kept copies of the things that didn't quite add up, the expense reports and the bank statements and the emails and the invoices. And I kept this file quietly and without announcing it, because I didn't want to believe I needed it, and I didn't want Nathan to know I had it. And I told myself it was just good practice just additional documentation, just being thorough, which was always true of me, always. So perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps I was imagining the pattern, and then I found the first real thing. The first thing that was not ambiguous. The first thing that could not be explained by a last-minute client location change or a home office preference. And I found it on a Tuesday afternoon in November when I was reviewing the quarterly financials, and I noticed a payment that had been made from the business account to an entity I did not recognize. A company called Nashco Creative Solutions. $14,000 paid in 3 installments over 6 weeks, and I searched my memory and my records and found no contract, no proposal, no email thread, no client context. Nothing that explained why Garrett Brand Consulting had paid $14,000 to a company called Nashco Creative Solutions. And I went to Nathan and I showed him the payments and I asked him to explain them, and he looked at the paper and he looked at me. And for the first time in our partnership, I saw something in his face that was not smooth, something that flickered behind the charm for just a moment before the charm closed back over it. And he said, "Oh yeah, Nashco. They did some subcontracted creative work on the Meridian account." And I said, "Nathan, I managed the Meridian account. I would know if we had subcontracted any creative work." And he said he had arranged it because he knew I was overloaded, and he had tried to take something off my plate. And I said, "Nathan, that is not how we operate. Every vendor relationship goes through me. Every payment over $500 requires both our signatures." And he said he knew he should have checked with me, and he was sorry, and it wouldn't happen again. And I looked at him and I said, "Nathan, I'm going to need you to show me the work product. Show me what Nashco Creative Solutions delivered for $14,000. And he said, of course, and he said he would pull everything together and send it to me that afternoon. And the afternoon came and went, and he sent me a PDF that contained some generic brand concept work that had no specific connection to the Meridian account, and that I could see immediately had not been created for the Meridian account. Because the Meridian account was a craft brewery, and the work in the PDF was clearly designed for a restaurant concept. And I sat with that PDF, and with the quiet, cold feeling of someone who has just seen the thing they did not want to see, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do. And what I did was this: I did not confront Nathan again that day. I went home and I opened my personal file and I put the Nashco payments in it and I put the PDF in it. And I added a detailed note about the conversation we had had and the explanation Nathan had given, and the evidence that the explanation was false. And then I made a phone call to a woman I had met at a business networking event the previous year, a woman named Carol Chen, who was a forensic accountant. And I explained to Carol in general terms that I had some financial discrepancies in my business, that I needed someone to look at quietly and carefully. And Carol said she could do that. And she came to my office on a Saturday when Nathan was not there, and I gave her access to the business financial records. And I went and sat in the conference room and waited, and Carol worked for 4 hours that Saturday, and at the end of the 4 hours, she came to find me in the conference room, and she put a printed summary on the table in front of me, and she said, "Sophia, I want to be careful about how I say this, so I'm going to be direct. There are significant irregularities in these accounts, significant and systematic, and going back at least 14 months. And I looked at the summary and I felt something that was not surprise, which was itself a kind of information. The fact that I was not surprised told me that some part of me had known, had been knowing for a while. And I said, "Carol, how much?" And she said, "Based on what I can see from these records, conservatively, somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. And I put my hands flat on the conference table, and I breathed and I said, "Can you document all of it?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "I need it documented completely, every transaction, every irregularity, dated and referenced and sourced." And she said, "I'll have a full report to you within 2 weeks." And I said, "Thank you, Carol," and she left. And I sat in that conference room alone for a long time before I went home. And what I felt sitting in that conference room was not rage, which surprised me. It was a very specific and very cold kind of grief, the grief of someone who has just had the worst possible version of a suspicion confirmed, the grief of someone who realizes that the hope they had been holding was not just misplaced, but had been actively used against them. Nathan had known I wanted to believe in him, and he had used that wanting. He had used my love and my hope and my loyalty as the cover under which he had been stealing from me steadily and systematically for over a year. And sitting with that understanding was one of the hardest things I have ever done. And then I got up and I went home and I made a plan. Because making a plan was what I did when things became unbearable. And the plan was this: I was going to continue to behave normally with Nathan until Carol's report was complete, and I had the full picture. I was not going to confront him or tip him off or give him any reason to take any action before I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and I was going to call my attorney, a man named David Park, who had handled my business legal work from the beginning and who I trusted completely. And I was going to begin the process of understanding my legal options. And I was going to document everything that happened from this moment forward with a level of detail that would make Carol's forensic report look like a rough draft. And I did all of these things. I kept my face neutral and my behavior normal around Nathan for 2 weeks while Carol finished her report, and while David reviewed my partnership agreement, and while I continued to add to my personal file every day. And the things that went into that file during those 2 weeks were remarkable in their detail and their clarity. Once I was looking for them with open eyes. I documented a phone call Nathan had in the conference room that he thought I couldn't hear, where he referenced a payment coming through to a personal account. I documented an afternoon when he left early, and I checked his computer and found emails to a vendor account that I had never heard of. I documented the specific dates and times of everything with the meticulous precision of someone who understands that documentation is not just record keeping. It is the architecture of truth. And Carol's report came in on a Thursday morning, and it was 63 pages long, and it was devastating. The total discrepancy was $87,000 over 16 months. It had been accomplished through a combination of fraudulent vendor payments to companies that Nathan controlled, expense reimbursements for expenses that had never occurred, and a series of smaller cash transactions that had been categorized in the books as miscellaneous operating costs. Carol's report was thorough and specific and sourced to individual transactions. And it was, in her professional opinion, evidence of deliberate and systematic financial fraud. And I read it twice, and then I called David and I said, "David, I need to see you today." And he said, "Come in." And I went in, and I put Carol's report on his desk, and I said, "Read this," and he read it. And when he was done, he looked at me over his glasses, and he said, "Sophia, this is serious." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Do you want to go to the police?" And I said, "I want to understand all my options first." And he said, "Okay." And we talked for 2 hours about what the options were, and what the consequences of each option were, and what the strength of my documentation was. And David said at the end of those 2 hours that my documentation was extraordinarily strong, that the combination of Carol's forensic report and my own personal file of records and the business records themselves created a case that he believed was very solid. And I said, "David, I want to pursue this. I want to pursue all of it, civil and criminal." And he said, "Sophia, are you sure? He's your brother." And I said, "David, he stole $87,000 from a company I built with my own hands. And my father's inheritance. My father has been dead for 4 years, and that money was the last thing my father gave me. And yes, I am sure." And David said, Okay, Sophia." And we started the process. And here is where I need to tell you something that happened that I had not anticipated. Something that changed the nature of what I was dealing with completely, and that elevated the situation from a painful family betrayal to something that required federal involvement. Because while David was preparing the civil complaint, and while I was continuing to document, and while Nate was continuing to come to the office and smile his smile and work his charm on clients who didn't know what I knew, while all of that was happening, I found something that the forensic report had not found. I found it by accident in a way that felt like providence or fate, or my father looking out for me from wherever he had gone. I was reviewing a set of documents in preparation for a client contract renewal, and I pulled the original signed contract from the filing cabinet. And I looked at it, and something about the signature on the final page stopped me. The signature that was supposed to be mine. My signature authorizing the initial contract terms. Something about it was wrong, not dramatically wrong. Not so wrong that it would have been obvious to a casual observer, but wrong in the specific way that your own signature is wrong when someone else has made it. The angle of the S in Sophia was slightly different, and the way the G connected in Garrett had a loop that I did not make. I did not make that loop. I had signed my name thousands of times, and I knew exactly how I signed it, and that was not how I signed it. And I felt my blood go very cold and very still, and I pulled other contracts from the filing cabinet. I pulled 5 more contracts. contracts with clients that Nathan had brought in during the previous year, and I looked at every signature on every final page. And 3 of them had the same wrong S and the same wrong loop in the G. 3 contracts that I had supposedly authorized and signed, and that I had never seen before in my life. Nathan had been signing my name to contracts. Nathan had been forging my signature on legal business documents, and the implications of that were not just the civil implications of the money he had stolen. The implications of that were federal. Forging signatures on contracts is fraud. It is wire fraud if any of those contracts had been executed electronically or had involved any form of electronic communication. And in the 21st century, every business contract involves electronic communication, every single one. And I sat down right there on the floor of my office with those contracts spread around me. And I thought about my father, and I thought about the $22,000. And I thought about the letter that said, Sophia, you have always known what you were building. Use this toward it. And I thought about what I had built and what Nathan had done to what I had built. And I felt something shift inside me that was permanent. A shift that closed a door that had been open my entire life. The door that said, Nathan is your brother, and you love him and love makes allowances. That door closed, not with anger, with something colder and cleaner than anger, with the specific resolve of someone who has finally seen the full picture and understood that there is only one right response to it. And I called David, and I told him what I had found. And David was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Sophia, this changes things significantly. And I said, I know, David. And he said, I need to bring in a colleague who handles federal cases. And I said, do it. And he said, this is going to become much larger than a civil matter. And I said, I understand. And he said, are you ready for that? And I said, David, I have been documenting this for 7 months. I am ready for whatever it takes. And the thing that I want to tell you about the period that followed, the months between finding those forged contracts and the day the case went to court, is that it was the hardest period of my life in a specific way that had nothing to do with legal processes or business recovery, and everything to do with my mother, because my mother did not know any of this was happening. And the question of when and how to tell her was one that I carried alone for a very long time. My mother, who had loved Nathan with the specific tenderness she had always had for him. My mother, who had no idea that her son had been systematically stealing from her daughter and forging her daughter's name on legal documents. My mother, who was 63 years old and had already lost her husband, and who I could not bear to hurt, and who I could not protect from this indefinitely. And I finally told her on a Sunday afternoon in her kitchen. I drove to her house and I sat across from her at the kitchen table, where we had eaten 1,000 meals. And I told her everything, calmly and completely, and with the documentation in a folder on the table between us. And my mother listened without interrupting for the entire time I was talking, and when I finished, she was very still for a very long moment. And then she said, are you sure? And I said, yes, Mom. And she said, completely sure. And I said, Mom, I have a 63-page forensic accounting report and 3 contracts with my signature forged on them, and yes, I am completely sure. And she looked at the folder, and she did not open it, and she said, Sophia. And I said, yes, Ethan. And she said, I'm so sorry. And I said, Mom, you didn't do anything. And I should have seen it. I should have seen what he was. And I said, Mom, his charm fooled everyone. And she said it shouldn't have fooled me. I was his mother. And we sat together in her kitchen with that between us for a while. And then she said, what are you going to do? And I told her, and she was very quiet. And then she nodded, and she said, do what you need to do, Sophia. Do what's right. And that was my mother giving me permission, that I didn't technically need, but that I needed in every way that mattered. And I hugged her and I drove home, and I called David and I said, move forward. And David said, we're moving forward. And the process that followed was long and procedurally complex, in ways that I am going to give you the important highlights of, rather than every step, because every step would take longer to describe than the rest of this story combined. The federal investigation was opened, based on the wire fraud elements of the forged contracts and the fraudulent vendor payments. And it involved investigators who were professional and thorough, and who, when I presented them with my documentation, with the personal file I had been keeping for 7 months, and Carol's forensic report, and the forged contracts and the business records, looked at what I had compiled and used a word that I have thought about many times since. The investigator, a woman named Agent Torres, looked at my documentation and said, this is exceptional, And I said, I've been keeping records since the beginning. And she said, I can see that. And she said, Miss Garrett, this kind of documentation makes our job significantly easier. And I said, good. I said I wanted it to be as easy as possible because I wanted there to be no ambiguity and no wiggle room and no version of events that Nathan could offer that would be able to survive contact with what I had put together. And Nathan was notified of the investigation, and I was not present for that notification. But David told me afterward that Nathan had initially denied everything. And then, when the investigator showed him Carol's report, he had attempted to characterize the hints as authorized. And when they showed him the forged contracts, he had gone very quiet, in the way that people go quiet when there is nothing left to say. And Nathan hired a lawyer, a criminal defense attorney. And the attorney did what criminal defense attorneys do, which is to look for every possible way to create doubt, and every possible procedural argument, and every possible narrative that might make what Nathan had done look like something other than what it was. And I want to tell you about the specific argument Nathan's attorney made that I found the most revealing. The argument was that Nathan had believed himself to be acting within the scope of his partnership role, that the financial decisions he had made were business decisions that he had genuinely believed he had the authority to make. And the argument about the signatures was that they had been executed in the normal course of business administration. And that Nathan had believed this was standard practice within their partnership. And I sat in David's office when David told me about this argument. And I thought about my brother. I thought about the person who had given me that argument as his defense. And I thought about how deeply you have to believe in your own charm to look at 63 pages of forensic accounting and 3 forged contracts and offer as your defense that you thought it was fine. And I felt something I had not expected to feel at that point in the process. I felt something that was almost pity, almost because the argument was so transparently constructed from the same charm over substance blueprint that Nathan had been using his entire life. And here he was in a federal investigation, still reaching for the same tool that had always gotten him out of things before. And I thought, Nathan, this time the tool is not going to work. Because this time there are 63 pages of forensic accounting, and this time there are federal investigators, and this time there is a sister who has been keeping records since the moment she first felt something was wrong. And the case moved toward trial, and the preparation was intensive, and I was involved in every part of it. I worked with David and with the federal prosecutor and with Carol, who was going to testify as an expert witness, and I reviewed every document and prepared for every question I was going to be asked. And I thought about my father every day. During this preparation, I thought about what he had said about honesty, and about the man he had been, and about the letter that said, use this toward it. And I thought about what it meant that the money he had left me and the business I had built with that money were at the center of what was happening. And the trial date was set, and it came. And I want to tell you about walking into that courtroom. Because the experience of walking into a courtroom where the case, being tried, is the case of your brother stealing your life's work is not something that I can describe quickly or easily. The courtroom was in federal court in Nashville, and it was a serious room, high ceilings and wood paneling, and the particular gravity of a space where important things are decided. And I walked in with David, and I sat at the plaintiff's table, and I did not look at Nathan. When he came in with his attorney, I made a decision not to look at him until I had to, and I kept that decision, and the trial began, and the opening statements were made, and then the evidence was presented. And Carol testified, and the federal investigator testified, and David questioned them, and Nathan's attorney cross-examined them. And through all of it, I sat at that table, and I was still, very still, the stillness of someone who has done everything they could possibly do to prepare, and who now has to trust the preparation. And then something happened that I had known was going to happen. Because David had told me it was coming, but that landed differently in the actual room than it had in David's office when he described it. The federal prosecutor stood up and he said, Your Honor, at this time, I would like to enter into evidence the documentation compiled by the plaintiff, Sophia Garrett. And he placed on the record my personal file, the 7 months of records I had kept, along with Carol's forensic report and the forged contracts. And then the judge, a man named Judge Raymond Holloway, who had the particular stillness of someone who has been making serious decisions for a long time and has made peace with the weight of them, Judge Holloway looked at the documentation and he began to read from it. And he read aloud the dates and the amounts and the transaction descriptions and the notes I had made about conversations and discrepancies and patterns. He read the entry about the Nashco Creative Solutions payment, and he read the entry about the phone call Nathan had made in the conference room, and he read the entry about the PDF that was supposed to be the Meridian creative work and was clearly not. He read all of it, item by item, in the quiet, authoritative voice of a federal judge in a wood-paneled courtroom in Nashville, Tennessee. And as he read, I finally looked at Nathan, and Nathan was looking at the table in front of him with an expression that I had never seen on my brother's face before in 38 years of knowing him. It was not the flickering behind the charm expression I had seen in my office when I first asked about the Nashco payments. It was something more complete than that. It was the expression of someone who has finally run out of room, who has finally reached the edge of the space that charm can create, and found that the space ends there and beyond it is only the truth. And the truth is in 63 pages of forensic accounting being read aloud by a federal judge. And I looked at my brother, and I felt things that were too complicated to name individually. Grief and anger, and the ghost of all the love I had ever had for him, and the specific sorrow of a sister who is watching her brother be held to account for something she would have given anything not to have to hold him to account for. And I looked away, and I looked at the judge, and I breathed, and I let the judge read. And Judge Holloway read for a long time. He was thorough in the way that good judges are thorough. He wanted the record to be complete, and it was complete because I had made it complete. Every entry in my personal file was in the court record, and every entry was being read aloud in a room where there was nowhere to hide from it, and no charm sufficient to soften it, and no explanation that could make $87,000 and 3 forged signatures into anything other than what they were. And when the judge finished reading, he set the papers down and the courtroom was very quiet. And then the proceedings continued and the arguments were made. And Nathan's attorney made his best case with what he had, which was not enough. And David made his case with what he had, which was everything, and the jury deliberated. And I sat in a conference room down the hall from the courtroom and waited with David. And I thought about my father. And I thought about the beginning, the very beginning, the first day of Garrett Brand Consulting when I had sat at a second-hand desk in a small rented office and answered my first client call with a voice that was steadier than I felt. And I thought about what it had taken to build that company and what it had meant and what it meant now. And the jury came back and the verdict was read, and Nathan was found guilty on 6 counts, including wire fraud and forgery and financial fraud. And I sat in that courtroom and I heard the word guilty 6 times, and each time it landed. It landed as both something necessary and something terrible. Necessary because it was true, and it was just, and it was the only right outcome given what had happened. And terrible because the person those words were applied to was Nathan. Was my brother. Was the person whose name and face and laugh had been part of every significant year of my life. And I did not feel triumph in that moment. I want you to know that. I did not feel the clean, satisfying triumph that you might expect. I felt something far more complicated and far more human. I felt the specific sorrow of a situation that should never have existed, of a brother who should never have done what he did, of a relationship that had been destroyed, not by the trial, but by the act that made the trial necessary. And I looked at Nathan as the verdict was read, and he looked back at me, and I cannot tell you precisely what passed between us in that look, because it was too much and too complex and too layered with history to reduce to a sentence. But I will tell you that it was real. It was the most honest moment Nathan and I had ever shared, because there was nothing left to hide behind. No charm and no explanation and no smoothness. Just 2 siblings looking at each other, across the wreckage of something that had been both built and destroyed. And the sentencing happened several weeks later, and Nathan received a sentence that included prison time and restitution. And I will not detail the specific terms because they are public record, and because the details are less important than the principle, which is that what Nathan did had consequences, real and documented and legally enforced consequences, and the restitution that was ordered was meaningful, though I knew, realistically, that the full amount would take years to collect and might never be fully collected. And I had made peace with that, because I had understood from the beginning that the legal process was not primarily about recovering the money. It was about the record, about the truth being established in a place and a form that could not be revised or charmed away. And after the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse in the Nashville afternoon. And David said, "Well, Sophia." And I said, "Well, David." And he said, "You built an extraordinary case." And I said, "I built an extraordinary record." And he said, "Same thing." And I said, "Yes, I suppose it is." And I went to see my mother that evening, and she opened the door and she looked at me, and she said, "Is it done?" And I said, "It's done, Mom." And she pulled me into a hug, and we stood in her doorway for a long moment. And she said, "Your father would be proud of you." And I said, "Mom." And she said he would, Sophia, not because of the verdict, but because of how you did it, because you did it right, because you documented everything, and you were patient and you let the truth do the work. And that's what your father always did. He always let the truth do the work. And I held on to my mother in her doorway, and I cried for the first time, since the whole thing had started, really cried. The kind of crying that is not weakness but release. The kind that comes when something enormous is finally over, and your body remembers that it has been holding itself together for a very long time and can now, finally, let go a little. And I cried for the money, and I cried for the business, and I cried for the brother I had needed him to be and who he had not been. And I cried for my father, who had given me the seed money and the letter, and who had been gone for 4 years, and who I wished with everything I had was still here to see what I had built and what I had survived. And then I stopped crying, and I went inside, and my mother made tea, and we sat at her kitchen table, and we talked about what came next. Because there was a what came next. And the what came next was important. And what came next was the rebuilding. And the rebuilding was in some ways harder than the building had been the first time. Because rebuilding requires you to face the damage before you can repair it. And the damage to Garrett Brand Consulting was real. In addition to the $87,000 that Nathan had taken the investigation, and the trial had created a period of instability that had cost the company clients and had cost me time and energy and focus that would otherwise have gone into growth. And there were relationships in the Nashville business community that had been complicated by the public nature of what had happened. Some people had pulled back during the investigation because they didn't know how the situation would resolve, and pulling back was the cautious thing to do. And I understood that, and I didn't blame them, but I also had to work to rebuild those relationships and to demonstrate to the market that Garrett Brand Consulting was sound and stable and run with the integrity that it had always been run with. And I did that work the same way I had done every other piece of work in my professional life, methodically and consistently, and without self-pity. I sat down with every client relationship, and I assessed it honestly. And I reached out personally to every client who had pulled back, and I had honest conversations about what had happened and about the steps I had taken to ensure the company's financial integrity going forward. I brought in a new financial oversight structure, a proper board of advisors with real authority over financial decisions. And I hired a full-time CFO, a woman named Diana who was meticulous and experienced and who I trusted completely. And I rebuilt the team that Nathan's departure and the disruption of the investigation had depleted. And slowly and steadily, the company came back. Not immediately, not in a rush, but consistently, client by client and month by month and quarter by quarter. And the thing that struck me during the rebuilding was how much stronger the foundation felt the second time. Maybe because I had tested it and it had held. Maybe because the people who stayed through the difficult period were people of genuine loyalty who I could count on in a way that fair-weather relationships never allow you to count on people. And maybe because I was operating with a clarity about what I was building and why that the early excitement of a new business can sometimes obscure. I knew exactly what I had and what it was worth and what I was willing to do to protect it and what I was never going to allow to happen to it again. And I want to tell you about the financial controls I put in place after Nathan, because they are specific. And they matter. And I think they are useful for anyone who is building something. Every payment above $1,000 requires 2 authorizations, and those authorizations are logged and reviewed monthly by the CFO. Every vendor relationship is documented from inception with a formal vendor agreement that specifies the services and the rates and the payment terms. Every bank statement is reviewed by both me and Diana every month, and any discrepancy, however small, is investigated immediately. And the personal file that I had kept during the investigation became the model for a formal company record system that is maintained by Diana and backed up in 3 separate locations, and that I review quarterly. And these are not paranoid measures. They are professional measures. They are the measures of someone who understands that a clean record is not just protection against fraud. It is the foundation of a trustworthy business, and a trustworthy business is what I promised my father I would build. And the company grew back and grew past where it had been before. And I want to tell you about something specific that happened about 2 years after the trial, because it is the kind of thing that deserves to be told. I was approached by a woman named Maria Delgado, who ran a small but growing hot sauce company in Nashville. She had been referred to me by another client, and she came to my office. And she was warm and direct and completely passionate about her product, in the way that the best food entrepreneurs always are. And she told me about her brand and her market and her goals, and I told her about what Garrett Brand Consulting could do for her. And at the end of the meeting, she said, "I've heard about what happened with your company a couple of years ago," and I said, "Yes." And she said, "I looked you up and I read about the case," and I said, "Okay." And she said, "I want to work with you because of how you ushled it." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You didn't hide from it. You documented everything. And you went through the proper channels and you let the process work." And she said, "I run a small business. And the thing I worry about most is someone taking advantage of me and someone not having a proper process." And she said, "You clearly have a proper process." And I said, "Maria, I have an exceptionally proper process." And she laughed and signed with us 2 weeks later. And Maria's hot sauce company grew substantially over the next 3 years with Garrett Brand Consulting's help, and she became one of my most valued clients and one of my favorite professional relationships. And she told me once over coffee that I was the most organized person she had ever worked with. And I said, "Maria, you have no idea." And the years went on and the company grew. And I grew with it. I became not just the founder of a successful boutique consulting firm, but something of a resource in the Nashville food and beverage business community. I spoke at industry events and mentored younger entrepreneurs, and served on the board of a local small business development organization. And I built a life that was genuinely full in the way that comes from doing work you believe in with people you respect, and from knowing that what you have built is solid and clean and entirely yours. And I want to tell you about Nathan, because you deserve to know what happened to Nathan and where things stand now. Nathan served his sentence and was released, and I knew about the release from my mother, who had maintained contact with him throughout, not without difficulty and not without pain, but she was his mother, and she could not maintain contact. And I understood that, and I never asked her to choose. I never put my mother in the position of choosing between her children, even after everything. Because my mother was not responsible for what Nathan had done, and because my mother had been present and honest throughout the process in a way that I could not fault, and Nathan reached out to me about a year after his release. He sent a letter, a handwritten letter, not an email, but an actual handwritten letter. And I want to tell you what was in it because it matters. In the letter, Nathan said that he had spent a long time, years really, not being honest with himself about who he was and what he had done, and that the process of the investigation and the trial and the sentence had been, in the most painful way imaginable, the first time in his adult life that he had been forced to actually be accountable for something in a way that charm could not fix. He said that watching the judge read my documentation in the courtroom had been the most humbling experience of his life, because every entry in that record was true, and he knew it was true, and there was no version of events he could offer that could make it not true. He said he was sorry, not in a quick or formulaic way, but in the specific, detailed way of someone who has thought very carefully about what they are apologizing for. He itemized what he had done the way my documentation had itemized it. He named each thing: the Nashco payments and the expense reimbursements and the cash transactions and the forged signatures. He named them all and said, "I did these things and they were wrong, and I did them knowingly. And the only honest thing I can tell you about why is that I was a person who had always found a way to take shortcuts. And you were always the person who did the actual work, and I told myself stories about why that was acceptable. And none of those stories were true. And I am sorry, Sophia. I am sorry for the money, and I am sorry for the signatures, and I am sorry for using your love for me as a tool. And I am sorry most of all for what I did to something that Dad's money helped you build." And I read that letter 3 times, and I put it in a drawer. And I thought about it for several weeks before I responded. And when I responded, I wrote back that I had received the letter and that I believed it was sincere, and that I was not going to pretend that sincerity was the same as resolution, that what he had done had real consequences that were not fully repaired by acknowledgement, and that I needed time and distance to figure out what, if any, relationship was possible between us going forward. I said I was not closing the door permanently, but I was not opening it fully either, and that I would be honest with him when I knew more about what I wanted, and that is where Nathan and I stand now, in a space between closed and open that I am navigating honestly and slowly, and without pressure from either direction. My mother is glad we are in contact, even if the contact is limited, and I think that is the right outcome for now, not a Hollywood reconciliation, and not a permanent estrangement, but something honest and in progress and real. And I am 41 years old. And Garrett Brand Consulting is 12 years old, and we have 32 active clients and a team of 19 people and a reputation in Nashville Stew's food and beverage community. That is, without false modesty, excellent. And I have a life that I am proud of in the complete way that comes from having built it from nothing, and having defended it when it needed defending, and having rebuilt it when it was damaged, and having done all of those things with honesty and precision, and the particular discipline of someone who learned very early from a very good man that the truth, properly documented, is the most powerful thing you can own. And I keep records. I still keep records. I will always keep records. Not out of fear or paranoia or bitterness, but because I am an accountant of my own life. And the account should always be clean and complete and true, because you never know when the judge is going to read them out loud, and the whole room is going to hear what actually happened. And when that moment comes, and it will come, you want every number to be right and every date to be accurate and every entry to be exactly what it says it is. You want the truth to be so thoroughly documented that it needs no advocate. It speaks entirely for itself, and mine did. Mine spoke for itself in a courtroom in Nashville on a Thursday afternoon in November. And every word it said was true, and every word was mine. And I had written every single one of them. And if you are listening to this right now and you are building something, building a business or a career or a life or any kind of structure that matters to you and that belongs to you, I want you to hear this. Document everything, not just the financial records and the contracts and the legal documents. Document the conversations and the patterns. And the things that don't quite add up, document them early before you know why you're documenting them. Document them in your own voice with dates and details, and your own honest assessment of what you observed. Because documentation is not distrust. Documentation is respect for the truth. And the truth needs your help to survive in a world where other people's versions of events are always competing with it. Give the truth what it needs. Give it dates and amounts and descriptions, and your own handwriting and your own memory rendered as precisely as you can render it. And then keep it safe and keep it complete. And keep adding to it every time something happens that belongs in the record. Because the record is not just protection, the record is the architecture of your own story. It is the thing that makes your story provable and permanent and yours, in a way that no one can take from you, even if they take everything else. And I know that because someone tried to take everything else from me, and they could not take the record, and the record was what gave me back everything they had taken and more. And so keep your records. Keep them the way you keep the people you love, carefully and completely, and with the understanding that they are precious and that they matter, and that one day, maybe on a Thursday afternoon in a wood-paneled courtroom, they are going to be the most important thing you ever made. Thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for listening to all of it, every word. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to hear it, then I am glad. I am genuinely glad. And if you have ever experienced something like what I have described, if you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely and had to find your way through it to something real on the other side, please leave a comment and tell me about it. Tell me where you are and what you're building and what you survived to get there. Because your story matters, and the people listening to this need to hear that it is possible to come through something like this with your integrity intact and your records clean, and your life genuinely yours. Subscribe if you believe that truth is worth documenting and that justice is worth waiting for, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about someone who refused to be erased and who built something that proved they were always exactly who they knew themselves to be. I will see you in the next one.